Literate peasants had seemingly leapfrogged the industrial might of the United States. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union was officially the second largest economy on Earth. It produced more steel, more tractors, more oil, and more cement than any other nation. On paper, their GDP was skyrocketing. To the economists in the West, the Soviet model, the command economy, looked like a terrifyingly effective rival to capitalism. But if you looked away from the military parades and walked into a grocery store in Moscow, the superpower vanished. You wouldn't see abundance, you would see the queue. A line of people waiting 3 hours for a loaf of bread that might not even be there when they reach the front. You would find a country that could build a space station, but couldn't figure out how to manufacture decent toilet paper. You would find a system where factories produce millions of shoes that nobody could wear because they were all the wrong size.
For decades, we were told the Soviet Union collapsed because of politics, because people wanted freedom. But that is only half the story. The Soviet Union collapsed because it fell victim to the greatest economic experiment in history. An experiment that proved you can force an economy to grow with a gun to its head, but you cannot force it to be efficient. Today we are asking, was the Soviet economy actually strong? Or was the entire system a Potemkin village, a superpower built on bad data, perverse incentives, and lies? To understand why the Soviet economy eventually imploded, we have to look at the engine under the hood. And it was an engine designed to defy the basic laws of economics.
In a market economy, like the US or modern Europe, resources are allocated by prices. If people want more cars, the price of cars goes up. This signals companies to buy more steel and hire more workers. It is decentralized, chaotic, and usually highly efficient. The invisible hand does the work. The Soviets rejected this. They believed the invisible hand was just a tool for exploitation. They replaced it with the visible hand of the state. This was Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. Imagine trying to plan the dinner menu for every single family in America every single night for 5 years in advance. Now, imagine doing that for every screw, every bolt, every tractor, and every liter of milk in a nation of 290 million people. That was the job of Gosplan. They used a system called material balances. It worked like this. The Politburo would set a political goal, say, we need 10,000 tanks. Gosplan would then calculate backwards. To make 10,000 tanks, we need 50,000 tons of steel. To get that steel, we need 100,000 tons of coal. To get that coal, we need 5,000 miners. To feed those miners, we need 10,000 tons of wheat. They did this for millions of products, without computers.
In the early days, specifically under Stalin, this actually worked. If your goal is simply industrialize at any cost, a command economy is incredible. You can literally move an entire population from farms to factories at gunpoint. Between 1928 and 1940, the Soviet Union achieved a level of industrial growth that took Britain a century to achieve. They brute forced their way into the 20th century. But this brute force growth hid a fatal flaw, a mathematical cancer that would eventually rot the system from the inside out. Here is where the economics gets interesting. The fatal flaw wasn't the planning itself. It was the incentives. In a capitalist firm, if a manager figures out a way to make a product using 10% fewer resources, he gets a bonus. The company makes a profit and the shareholders are happy. Efficiency is rewarded. In the Soviet Union, efficiency was punished. Let's introduce you to a concept known as the ratchet effect. Imagine you are a Soviet factory manager. Your quota for the year is to produce 1,000 tractors. Let's say you are a genius. You reorganize the floor, you motivate the workers, and you manage to produce 1,200 tractors. Do you get a raise? No. Do you get a vacation? No. What happens is that the central planner in Moscow looks at your report and says, aha, clearly you have the capacity to make 1,200. So next year, your quota is 1,250. The target only ever goes up, like a ratchet.
Smart managers learned this lesson instantly. They realized that the only way to survive was to lie. If you could make 1,000 tractors, you told Moscow you could only make 800. You hid resources, you hoarded workers, you deliberately slowed down production to ensure you never ever exceeded the plan by too much. This created a culture of mediocrity. Innovation wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. If you installed a new machine that made work faster, you were just digging your own grave for next year's quota. So, Soviet factories continued to use technology from the 1930s well into the 1980s. But it gets worse, because there were no prices to determine value. The planners had to set targets based on physical measurements, quantity, weight, or length. This led to some of the most ridiculous economic anecdotes in history. There's a famous story, likely apocryphal but economically accurate, about a Soviet nail factory. One year, Gosplan set the quota for nails based on quantity. You must produce 1 million nails. So the manager, wanting to meet the quota with the least effort, produced 1 million tiny microscopic nails that were useless for construction. The planners saw this and were furious. So the next year, they changed the target. You must produce 1,000 tons of nails. So the manager produced one gigantic solid iron nail that weighed 1,000 tons. This is funny, but it had real-world consequences. Glass factories were given targets based on square meters, so they made the glass dangerously thin to get more area. When the planners changed the target to weight, they made the glass so thick it was opaque. Chandeliers were priced by weight, so factories filled them with lead to make them heavier and more expensive. The system was blind to utility. It didn't care if the product was useful. It only cared that the product existed on a spreadsheet. This is why the Soviet Union produced more shoes than the United States, but Soviet citizens still stood in line for shoes. The factories were making millions of shoes, but they were ugly, uncomfortable, and fell apart in a week. They met the quota, but they failed the consumer. As the economy stagnated in the 1970s, the lying moved from the factory floor to the highest levels of government. The pressure to show growth became so intense that entire industries began to fake their existence. The most staggering example of this was the Uzbek cotton affair. Uzbekistan was responsible for growing the cotton to clothe the Union. Moscow demanded higher and higher yields every year, targets that were physically impossible given the land and water available. The local leaders faced a choice: admit failure and go to the gulag, or lie. They chose to lie. For years, Uzbekistan reported record-breaking harvests. They sent reports to Moscow claiming they had gathered millions of tons of cotton. Moscow was thrilled. They sent billions of rubles in payments and bonuses to the Uzbek leaders. But the cotton didn't exist. To cover up the fraud, the empty trains were sent back and forth across the country to simulate shipping. Warehouses were labeled as full when they were empty. It is estimated that nearly 4.5 million tons of cotton existed only on paper. The Soviet GDP was calculating this ghost cotton. The statistics showed a booming economy, but in reality, the money was being stolen, and the textile factories in Russia were sitting idle, waiting for raw materials that would never arrive. This reveals the terrifying truth about the Soviet superpower. By the 1980s, no one actually knew how big the economy was. The planners were using fake data to plan a fake economy.
So if the system was so broken, how did it survive for so long? The answer is simple: luck. Specifically, geologic luck. In the 1970s, vast oil reserves were discovered in Siberia, right as global oil prices skyrocketed. This was a lifeline. The Soviet Union became a petrostate. They pumped oil, sold it to the West for hard currency, and used that money to buy the grain and food they couldn't figure out how to grow themselves. But inside the country, the currency, the ruble, was becoming worthless. Money implies that you can buy things, but in the USSR, having money didn't mean you could buy a car. You had to have money, plus a spot on the waiting list, plus the right connections. This gave rise to the shadow economy, or blot. The Soviet Union ran on favors. A butcher would save the best meat for the doctor, so the doctor would give him a sick note. The store manager would save a pair of jeans for the mechanic, so the mechanic would fix his car. The official planned economy was rigid and dead. The real economy was a chaotic web of bribery and black market trading. It was the only way people survived. By the 1980s, the USSR was spending nearly 20% of its GDP on the military. For context, the US spends about 3 to 4% today. They were building thousands of nuclear warheads while their hospitals reused syringes and their citizens waited 10 years for a telephone line. They were a superpower with third world living standards. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. He looked at the spreadsheets and realized the terrifying truth. The country was bankrupt. The oil prices had dropped and the free money was gone. He tried to fix it with perestroika. He tried to introduce a little bit of market competition into the planned system. But you cannot be a little bit pregnant, and you cannot have a partial command economy. Once a state stopped setting prices and guaranteed purchases, the supply chains snapped. Factory managers, finally free from the plan, stripped the assets and sold them. The ghost economy was exposed. The shelves went from having some food to having zero food. The illusion of the superpower evaporated. The GDP, which had been inflated by ghost cotton and heavy nails for decades, crashed to reality.
The tragedy of the Soviet economy isn't just that it failed, it's how it failed. It proved that you can mobilize a nation to do great things. You can defeat Nazis, you can build dams, and you can shoot for the stars. The command economy is excellent at focusing on one big goal. But life isn't one big goal. Life is a billion little goals. It's getting a coffee, buying jeans, fixing a leak, finding a book. No central planner, no matter how smart, can manage the complexity of human desire. The Soviet Union built a superpower on the assumption that they could outsmart the market. They thought they could replace the chaotic signals of prices with the clean order of a spreadsheet. But in doing so, they created a system where lying was rational, efficiency was punished, and the only things that were plentiful were the weapons of war. Was it all that bad? In terms of human potential wasted? Yes, it was.
If you found this analysis interesting, consider liking and subscribing. We cover the economics behind the history you thought you knew. And let me know in the comments below, do you think a planned economy could work today with modern supercomputers and AI? Or is the human element always the glitch in the system? Thanks for watching and see you next time.